They stood at the edge of her fields, laughing as they pointed at the shriveled, gray, fuzzed harvest. The town's elite called it a rotting disaster. The bank handed her a foreclosure notice, demanding she sell the land for pennies. But what those seasoned, arrogant farmers saw as a tragic end, Evelyn Hayes recognized as a rare, golden miracle. In less than 12 months, the very crop they mocked would transform a bankrupt daughter into the valley's first self-made millionaire. The Willamette Valley was usually a place of sprawling, emerald beauty in the late summer. But to Evelyn Hayes, the landscape felt like a beautifully decorated cage. She stood at the crest of Briarwood Estate, a 60-acre vineyard that had been in her family for 3 generations. The vines were heavy with Pinot Gris grapes, the soil rich and dark, yet the air was thick with the scent of impending ruin. Her father, Harrison Hayes, had passed away 6 months ago, leaving behind a legacy of unparalleled craftsmanship and a mountain of crippling debt. Harrison had been a purist, a man who believed in traditional farming, refusing to yield to the aggressive mass-production tactics of modern agribusiness. He had mortgaged the farm to the hilt to survive 3 consecutive years of drought. Now, the debt had fallen squarely onto Evelyn's 28-year-old shoulders. The bank had given her exactly 1 season to make good on the arrears. Everything, her home, her heritage, her future, hinged on the autumn harvest. Evelyn wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands calloused and stained with earth. She was a city-educated botanist who had abandoned a lucrative research position in Chicago the moment her father fell ill. She had traded laboratory coats for flannel and steel-toed boots, determined to save the only home she had ever known. The crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke the morning silence. A sleek, midnight black truck rolled up the long driveway, stopping just short of the main barn. Out stepped Wyatt Preston. Wyatt was the patriarch of Preston Farms, a sprawling corporate agricultural empire that bordered Briarwood. He was a man who viewed land not as a living, breathing ecosystem, but as a balance sheet. He had been trying to buy Briarwood for a decade, circling the struggling estate like a vulture waiting for the final breath. "Morning, Evelyn," Wyatt called out, his voice dripping with practiced folksy charm. He adjusted his expensive Stetson, his sharp blue eyes scanning the vineyard. "Looks like you've got a decent yield coming in, assuming you can afford the hands to pick it." Evelyn stiffened, wiping her hands on her jeans. "We're managing fine, Wyatt. The harvest is 2 weeks out. The grapes are testing perfectly for sugar content." Wyatt chuckled, a low, grating sound. He stepped closer, pulling a folded piece of paper from his tailored jacket. "I spoke with the loan officers at First National yesterday. You're drowning, kid. 1 bad frost, 1 mechanical failure, and the bank seizes the deed. I'm offering you a way out." He held out the paper. 200,000. I take the land, the debts, and you walk away with enough cash to start over back in the city. Evelyn didn't even look at the paper. "The land is worth $2 million, Wyatt, and it's not for sale." "It's worth what it can produce," Wyatt countered, his smile vanishing, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "And right now, it's producing a whole lot of stress for a girl who's in way over her head. Don't let pride make you a pauper, Evelyn." He tipped his hat and got back into his truck, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Evelyn watched him go, her jaw set. She turned back to the vines, drawing a deep, steadying breath. She had to focus. The harvest had to be perfect, but nature had other plans. 3 days later, a freak weather system rolled into the valley. A heavy, unseasonable rainstorm pounded the region for 48 hours, followed immediately by an intense, lingering morning fog and blazing afternoon heat. It was a bizarre, volatile cocktail of humidity and temperature swings. On the 4th morning, Evelyn walked out into the fields for her daily inspection. The thick mist clung to the ground like a shroud. She approached the first row of vines, reaching out to cup a cluster of grapes. Her heart stopped. The plump, green-gold skin of the grapes was gone. Instead, the clusters were shriveled, puckered like raisins, and covered in a fine, powdery gray fuzz. Panic, icy and sharp, clawed at her throat. She ran to the next row. The same. She sprinted down the hill, checking the lower blocks. Row after row, acre after acre. The gray rot had spread like a plague overnight. The damp, humid conditions had birthed a monstrous fungal infection that was aggressively devouring her entire crop. "No," Evelyn whispered, her knees hitting the damp earth. "No, no, no, please." She pulled a rotting cluster from the vine. It squished under her fingers, a hideous, unappetizing mess. The harvest, her lifeline, her father's legacy, her only defense against Wyatt Preston and the bank, was completely, undeniably destroyed. The news of the Briarwood disaster spread through the small town of Oak Haven faster than a wildfire. In a farming community, other people's crops were everyone's business, and Evelyn's failure was the talk of the local diner, the feed store, and the bank lobby. By noon the next day, Gregory Lawson, the county's senior crop appraiser, arrived at the estate. Gregory was a stern, by-the-book man who had evaluated valley crops for 30 years. He walked through the vineyards with Evelyn, his clipboard pressed against his chest, his face a mask of grim finality. He didn't need long. After inspecting just 4 rows, he stopped, pulling off his glasses and sighing. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," Gregory said, his tone carrying a mix of pity and condescension. "It's Botrytis cinerea. Gray rot. The humidity spike after the rain created a perfect breeding ground. It's an aggressive strain." "How much is salvageable?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling despite her desperate attempts to keep it steady. Gregory looked at her, his expression softening into one of deep sympathy, which was somehow worse than Wyatt's cruelty. "None of it. The grapes are desiccated. The fungal casing has ruined the aesthetic and structural integrity of the fruit. No winery in the state will touch this. It's a total loss. I have to write it up as a zero-yield event." A total loss. The words rang in her ears like a death knell. Within 48 hours, the seasonal workers Evelyn had hired to help with the harvest began to abandon the estate. They were practical people. They couldn't afford to waste their time on a dead crop when other farms were paying top dollar for healthy harvests. Only one man stayed. Samuel Brooks, a grizzled, quiet farmhand in his late 50s who had worked alongside Evelyn's father for 20 years. Samuel didn't say much. He just showed up at the barn the morning after the workers left, quietly sharpening the harvesting shears. "You don't have to stay, Samuel," Evelyn told him, standing in the doorway of the barn, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. "I can't pay you. The bank is going to freeze my accounts by Friday when I miss the mortgage payment." Samuel didn't look up from his whetstone. "Your daddy pulled me out of a bad spot a long time ago, Miss Evelyn. I don't abandon a haze when the sky falls." Later that afternoon, Evelyn made a desperate trip into town to beg the bank for an extension. When she walked into the local diner to grab a coffee, the low hum of conversation abruptly died. She felt the eyes of Oak Haven's farming elite boring into her back. In the corner booth sat Wyatt Preston, surrounded by his foreman. He didn't even try to hide his amusement. "Hey, Evelyn," Wyatt called out, his voice booming across the diner. "I hear you're growing penicillin up on that hill now. You branching out into pharmaceuticals?" A cruel ripple of laughter swept through the room. Evelyn's cheeks burned. She grabbed her coffee and walked out, her spine rigid, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Back at the farmhouse, she sat alone in her father's study, staring at the foreclosure notices piling up on the desk. She was ruined. The town thought she was a joke, a naive city girl who had foolishly tried to play farmer. She opened her laptop, mindlessly clicking through agricultural forums and botanical databases. If she was going down, she at least wanted to understand the enemy that had defeated her. She typed in Botrytis cinerea. Page after page of articles confirmed Gregory's assessment. Gray rot, destructive, devastating to vineyards. But as she scrolled deep into a European viticulture database, her eyes caught a strange, obscure term buried in an academic paper from France. Pourriture noble. She translated it in her head. Noble rot. Evelyn leaned closer to the screen, Her brow furrowing, she clicked the link. The article described a rare, highly prized phenomenon that occurred in very specific, hyper-localized microclimates, specifically in regions of France and Hungary, under the exact right sequence of weather conditions: damp, foggy mornings followed by dry, sunny afternoons. Botrytis cinerea did not destroy the grape. Instead, it punctured the skin, dehydrating the fruit, while perfectly preserving and hyperconcentrating the sugars and acids inside. It altered the chemical composition of the grape, introducing notes of honey, ginger, and honeysuckle. Grapes afflicted by noble rot were not garbage. They were the essential ingredient for the rarest, most expensive dessert wines in the world. Evelyn's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She pulled up the meteorological data for the valley over the last week. Heavy rain, dense morning fog, blazing, dry afternoon heat. It was the exact same weather pattern. She sprang from her chair, grabbed a flashlight, and sprinted out into the pitch-black vineyard. She ran to the nearest vine, her breathing ragged, and snapped off one of the ugly, shriveled, fuzzy grapes. She wiped the gray dust off on her jeans and, ignoring every instinct of self-preservation, popped the rotting grape into her mouth and bit down. There was barely any juice, just a thick, viscous drop. But as it hit her tongue, Evelyn gasped. It didn't taste like rot. It tasted like an explosion of concentrated nectar, complex and intensely sweet, unlike anything she had ever experienced. They weren't ruined. They were perfect. Evelyn burst into the barn the next morning, just as the sun was peeking over the horizon. Samuel was sweeping the floor, pausing as she ran in, out of breath, a manic light in her eyes. "We're harvesting," she announced, her voice shaking with adrenaline. Samuel looked at her, then slowly looked out the barn doors toward the gray, shriveled fields. "Miss Evelyn, there's nothing out there but dust and rot." "It's not just rot, Samuel," she said, grabbing a pair of shears from the workbench. "It's noble rot. The conditions have to be absolute perfection for it to happen, and by some absolute miracle, our microclimate hit the jackpot. The grapes are safe, but the window is incredibly narrow. If it rains again, the rot turns destructive and ruins them completely. We have to pick them now." Samuel stared at her for a long moment. He didn't understand the science, but he understood the fierce, unyielding determination in her eyes, a look he had seen 1,000 times in her father. He slowly set down the broom and picked up a basket. "Then we best get to work." What followed was the most grueling, agonizing labor of Evelyn's life. Harvesting botrytized grapes was not like a normal harvest. You couldn't just strip the clusters off the vine. Because the rot affected the clusters unevenly, they had to go through the entire 60 acres, vine by vine, branch by branch, individually selecting only the fully shriveled berries and leaving the rest to continue decaying. It required tweezers, tiny shears, and agonizing precision. With only 2 of them, the task was monumental. For 12 days, Evelyn and Samuel practically lived in the fields. They started an hour before dawn, wearing headlamps, their fingers freezing in the morning chill. By midday, the sun beat down on them mercilessly. Their backs screamed in pain, their hands bled from the sharp vines, and their clothes were constantly coated in the thick, gray spores of the fungus. Down in the valley, word got around that the Hayes girl had lost her mind. Wyatt Preston drove his truck up to the property line one afternoon, rolling down his window to watch Evelyn on her hands and knees in the dirt, painstakingly plucking fuzzy, ruined grapes into a small bucket. "You're breaking my heart, Evelyn," Wyatt yelled over the roar of his engine. "It's over. Go pack your bags. You're picking garbage." Evelyn didn't even turn her head. She just kept her eyes on the fruit, carefully snipping a perfectly shriveled grape and dropping it into her basket. Let them laugh, she thought, wiping a streak of dirt and sweat from her forehead. Let them think I'm insane. By the end of the second week, her hands were so cramped she could barely hold her coffee mug. But the harvest was complete. They had gathered barely a fraction of the weight of a normal harvest. The dehydration meant that it took a whole vine's worth of grapes to produce a single glass of liquid. Now came the hardest part, the pressing. The shriveled grapes were tough and unyielding. When Evelyn loaded the first batch into her father's vintage hydraulic press, she prayed to whatever gods governed the soil. She engaged the machinery. The press whined, groaning under the pressure as it squeezed the desiccated fruit. For a terrifying minute, nothing happened. The press pushed harder, the metal creaking. Samuel stood beside her, holding his breath. Then a single drop emerged from the spout. It wasn't the pale, watery juice of a normal Pinot Gris. It was thick, almost like syrup. It caught the light of the barn, glowing with an intense, brilliant amber hue. It dripped into the collection vat, slowly, painfully, slowly. Drop by golden drop, Evelyn placed a tasting glass under the spout, catching a small amount. She held it up to the light. The liquid was heavy, clinging to the glass like liquid gold. She took a sip. Tears instantly pricked her eyes. The flavor was staggering. It was an impossibly rich symphony of apricot, honey, toasted caramel, and an electric zing of acidity that perfectly balanced the massive sweetness. It was, without question, the greatest thing her family's land had ever produced. She looked at Samuel, a slow, triumphant smile breaking across her exhausted, dirt-streaked face. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We are going to make them eat every single word." The pressing of the botrytized grapes was only the first grueling battle in a war that Evelyn Hayes was rapidly losing on the financial front. Extracting the thick, sugary nectar from the desiccated husks had taken weeks of agonizing labor, leaving Evelyn and Samuel Brooks utterly exhausted. But nature, it seemed, was entirely indifferent to human fatigue. The juice they had collected, barely 300 gallons of the viscous, golden liquid, now had to undergo fermentation, a process that proved to be just as temperamental and terrifying as the harvest itself. In a traditional vintage, fermentation is a relatively straightforward affair. The natural yeasts consume the sugars, producing alcohol, and the process completes itself in a matter of weeks. But the noble rot had fundamentally altered the chemical structure of Evelyn's harvest. The sugar concentration in the juice was so staggeringly high that it became a hostile environment for the yeast. The microscopic organisms struggled to survive in the dense, syrupy must, working at an agonizingly slow, lethargic pace. Winter descended upon the Willamette Valley with a bitter, biting cold that seeped into the bones of the old Briarwood barn. Evelyn practically lived in the cellar, draped in heavy wool blankets, constantly monitoring the temperature of the oak barrels. If the ambient temperature dropped too low, the fragile fermentation process would completely stall, leaving her with overly sweet, unfermented syrup. If it spiked, the yeast would die off prematurely. It was a terrifying, delicate tightrope walk of biochemistry. Meanwhile, the vultures were circling the estate with increasing aggression. By mid-November, the bank's patience had entirely evaporated. Mitchell Reed, a junior loan officer desperately trying to climb the corporate ladder at First National, drove out to the estate with a final notice of foreclosure. Mitchell was a man who wore suits that were slightly too tight and carried a briefcase that looked far more important than he was. He found Evelyn in the tractor shed, grease smeared across her cheek as she tried to repair a rusted hydraulic line. "Evelyn, I take absolutely no pleasure in this," Mitchell said, holding out a thick manila envelope, though his crisp, unfeeling tone suggested otherwise. "You missed the October payment. You missed the November payment. The board has voted. We are initiating the seizure protocols. You have 30 days to vacate the primary residence." Evelyn wiped her hands on an oily rag, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the envelope, but refused to take it. "Mitchell, you know my father banked with First National for 40 years. He built this farm with your institution. I have product in the cellar right now. It just needs time." "Product?" Mitchell scoffed, glancing around the dilapidated shed. "Okay, Evelyn, the whole county knows what happened here. Gregory Lawson logged your harvest as a total, catastrophic loss. You're fermenting rotten grape water. The bank cannot accept hopes and dreams as collateral." Wyatt Preston has already submitted a preemptive cash offer for the deed the moment it goes to auction. It's over. The mention of Wyatt's name ignited a white-hot spark of fury deep within Evelyn's chest. She refused to let that arrogant, corporate parasite steal her family's legacy. "How much?" Evelyn asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "How much to halt the foreclosure and buy me 6 months?" Mitchell sighed, pulling a calculator from his coat pocket. "To bring the account current and cover the projected interest for a 6-month grace period, you would need $45,000 by Friday. And let's be honest, Evelyn, you don't even have $45. Evelyn turned away from him, her eyes locking onto the massive green John Deere combine harvester sitting in the corner of the shed. It was her father's pride and joy, a $250,000 piece of machinery that had been fully paid off years ago. It was essential for farming the lower acreage, the very beating heart of their agricultural operations. Without it, standard harvesting would be impossible. "I'll have the money by Thursday," Evelyn said, her voice devoid of emotion. That afternoon, she called a liquidator from 3 counties over. She sold the combine, the vintage flatbed truck, and every piece of mechanical equipment that wasn't bolted to the floor, taking a devastating 70% loss on their actual value just to get the cash immediately. When the flatbed tow trucks arrived to haul the machinery away, Samuel stood silently in the driveway, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Evelyn couldn't bear to watch. She retreated to the cellar, burying her tears in the darkness as she listened to the gentle, slow bubbling of the oak barrels. She had essentially amputated the farm's limbs to keep its heart beating just a little bit longer. Through December and January, the fermentation crawled at a microscopic pace. Evelyn spent her nights reading ancient, dusty French viticulture tomes she had ordered from university libraries, trying to understand the alchemy happening in her cellar. She learned that the noble rot, the botrytis cinerea, did more than just concentrate sugar. It metabolized the tartaric acid and produced glycerol, which gave the wine a silky, luxurious mouthfeel. It was a magical, transformative decay. But Wyatt Preston was not content to simply wait for her to fail. He was actively working to expedite her demise. In late February, Evelyn attempted to order custom glass bottles for her impending yield. Because dessert wine is traditionally bottled in smaller, 375-milliliter bottles to emphasize its rarity and value, she couldn't use the standard stock she had in the shed. She contacted the regional glass supplier in Portland, only to be told that their entire inventory of specialty glass had been bought out for the next 2 years. Bought out by who? Evelyn had asked the sales rep over the phone, a sinking feeling in her stomach. Preston Farms, the rep replied apologetically. Mr. Preston expanded his portfolio. He bought out our entire specialty contract. I'm sorry, Ms. Hayes. We legally can't sell to you. Wyatt was systematically cutting off her supply lines. He wanted her trapped, helpless, and completely unable to bring her product to market. He was wielding his immense wealth like a bludgeon. Forced into a corner, Evelyn spent a week desperately calling suppliers across the country. She finally found a small, artisanal glassblower in Ohio who had a surplus of beautiful, slender, clear glass bottles. They were exorbitantly expensive, and the shipping costs completely drained the absolute last of her emergency savings. But she had no choice. She wired the money, leaving her bank account balance at exactly $14.12. By early April, the bubbling in the barrels finally ceased. The yeast, exhausted and overwhelmed by the alcohol and sugar, had naturally died off. The fermentation was complete. Evelyn and Samuel stood in the damp, cool cellar, a single bare bulb illuminating the space. Evelyn held a glass thief, a long glass tube used for extracting wine from a barrel. Her hands shook violently as she dipped the thief into the bunghole of the primary oak barrel. She drew up a small sample and released it into a crystal-tasting glass. The liquid was breathtaking. It had clarified over the winter, dropping its sediment to the bottom of the barrel, leaving behind a brilliant, luminescent liquid that looked like melted topaz. It clung to the sides of the glass in thick, slow-moving legs, showcasing the immense concentration of the vintage. Evelyn brought the glass to her nose, closing her eyes. The aroma was an explosion of sensory perfection. It smelled of dried apricots, honeycomb, toasted almonds, marmalade, and a delicate, haunting floral note of white blossoms. It was intensely powerful, leaping out of the glass to fill the damp cellar with the fragrance of a sun-drenched orchard. She took a sip, allowing the wine to coat her palate. It was a revelation. The texture was incredibly rich and heavy, coating the tongue like silk, but it was immediately pierced by a vibrant, electric streak of acidity that completely prevented it from being cloying or overly sweet. The flavors evolved rapidly. First, a wave of sweet peach and mango, followed by a deeply complex, savory undertone of ginger and wet stone, ending with a finish that lingered on the palate for minutes. It was perfect. It was a masterpiece born from ruin. Evelyn opened her eyes, tears spilling over her lashes. She looked at Samuel, handing him the glass. The stoic old farmhand took a sip, his bushy eyebrows shooting up toward his hairline. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, staring at the golden liquid in absolute awe. "Miss Evelyn," Samuel whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse. "I have drank wine in this valley for 50 years. I have never tasted anything like this." "It's a miracle," Evelyn breathed, staring at the wooden barrels. "It's not a miracle," Samuel corrected her gently, looking her straight in the eye. "It's grit. You didn't give up." They had the wine. They bottled it by hand, carefully corking each of the precious, slender bottles and sealing them with dark gold wax. They produced exactly 1,200 bottles. It was a microscopic yield compared to the hundreds of thousands of bottles Wyatt Preston churned out annually, but to Evelyn it was a treasure beyond measure. She named it Briarwood Crown. But having the greatest wine in the valley meant absolutely nothing if she couldn't sell it. She had no marketing budget, no distributors, and zero reputation. The local wine merchants still viewed her as the laughingstock of Oak Haven, the crazy girl who tried to ferment rotten grapes. No one would even take a meeting with her. Evelyn needed a stage. She needed the world to taste it blindly, without the prejudice of her name or the stigma of her ruined harvest. And she knew exactly where to go. The Pacific Northwest Vintners Invitational was not just a wine competition. It was the definitive king-making battleground for the West Coast agricultural elite. Held annually in the opulent, glittering ballroom of the Grand Hotel in downtown Seattle, the Invitational drew the most prestigious master sommeliers, vicious wine critics, and high-end restaurant buyers in the nation. To win a gold medal at the Invitational was to guarantee instant commercial success. To win Best in Show was to become a legend. The entry fee was $1,000 per submission. Evelyn had $14 to her name. In a move of absolute, reckless desperation, Evelyn drove to a pawn shop in Portland and placed her grandmother's diamond engagement ring on the glass counter. It was the last piece of family jewelry she owned, a treasured heirloom she had sworn to never part with. The pawnbroker, a shrewd man who smelled desperation like blood in the water, gave her exactly $1,050 for it. Evelyn didn't even argue. She took the cash, walked directly to the post office, and overnighted her registration forms and 3 bottles of Briarwood Crown to the Seattle Judging Committee. 2 weeks later, Evelyn stood in the back of the Grand Hotel ballroom, feeling entirely invisible and completely out of place. The room was a sea of bespoke Italian suits, expensive perfumes, and clinking crystal. Massive chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the long tasting tables, where hundreds of the finest wines from Oregon, Washington, and California were being poured. The air was thick with the pretentious hum of industry networking. Evelyn wore a simple, slightly faded navy dress she had bought from a thrift store 5 years ago. She had driven 5 hours through the night in Samuel's beat-up pickup truck just to be there, sleeping in the cab in the hotel parking lot to avoid paying for a room. Across the ballroom, holding court near the center stage, was Wyatt Preston. He was surrounded by a sycophantic entourage of distributors and journalists, laughing boisterously as he poured samples from a massive, ostentatious bottle of his mass-produced Cabernet Sauvignon. He looked like a king surveying his conquered territory. Suddenly, Wyatt's eyes locked onto Evelyn. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by genuine confusion, before contorting into a cruel sneer. He whispered something to his group, and they all turned to stare at her, chuckling quietly. Wyatt detached himself from the crowd and swaggered over to where Evelyn was standing near the exit doors. "Well, if it isn't the Phantom of Oakhaven," Wyatt purred, looking her up and down with blatant condescension. "I honestly didn't think they let vagrants into the Grand. Did you get lost looking for the soup kitchen, Evelyn?" Evelyn stood her ground, her spine rigid, refusing to let him intimidate her. "I'm an entrant, Wyatt, same as you." Wyatt threw his head back and laughed, a loud, barking sound that drew stares from nearby attendees. "An entrant? Oh, that is precious. What did you submit? A jar of that gray, furry compost you scraped off your dead vines? Evelyn, this is the major leagues. These judges are master sommeliers. They don't have time for a bankrupt little girl playing pretend. You should have taken my money when you had the chance. Now I'm just going to buy your land at the courthouse auction next week for pennies." "We'll see about that," Evelyn said evenly, her voice remarkably steady, despite the hurricane of anxiety raging in her chest. At that moment, the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, and a hush fell over the crowd. The head judge, an internationally feared and respected master sommelier named Charles Harrington, stepped up to the microphone on the main stage. Charles was a notoriously brutal critic, a man who had famously spit out $1,000 Bordeaux on live television, calling it uninspired swill. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles began, his crisp British accent cutting through the silence. "We have concluded the blind tasting portion of the evening. The judges have deliberated. We will now announce the medals, culminating in the highest honor. Best in Show." For the next agonizing hour, Evelyn stood frozen against the wall. She listened as Charles read out the names of prestigious, multi-million-dollar estates, awarding them bronze, silver, and gold medals. Wyatt Preston's farm took home a silver medal for their Syrah, prompting raucous cheers from his entourage. Wyatt shot Evelyn a triumphant, arrogant smirk. As the awards wound down, Evelyn's hope began to fracture. She hadn't been called. The bronze and silver categories for dessert wines passed without her name. The gold category was announced. Nothing. Her chest tightened. She had failed. The pawned ring, the sold machinery, the agonizing labor, it had all been for nothing. The judges had likely disqualified her wine, finding it too strange, too unconventional. She closed her eyes, fighting back hot tears, preparing to slip out the back doors and drive home to pack her belongings. And finally, Charles Harrington's voice boomed over the speakers, commanding absolute silence in the massive room. "We come to the culmination of our event, the award for Best in Show, the single highest-scoring wine across all categories, varietals, and regions." Charles paused, looking down at the card in his hand. He adjusted his glasses, a look of profound bewilderment washing over his usually stoic features. "I have been judging wines for 35 years, Charles said slowly, leaning closer to the microphone. "I have tasted the finest vintages from Chateau d'Yquem in Bordeaux to the historic cellars of Tokai. But today, the judging panel was presented with a blind submission that completely defied our comprehension." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Wyatt Preston leaned forward, practically salivating, clearly expecting to hear his estate's name called. "This wine," Charles continued, his voice trembling slightly with genuine emotion, "is a masterclass in balance, complexity, and sheer, audacious brilliance. It possesses a viscosity and flavor profile that can only be achieved through the miraculous, impossible occurrence of perfect noble rot. A phenomenon we believed virtually impossible to cultivate in this region. It is, without hyperbole, the most extraordinary dessert wine I have ever tasted on American soil." Evelyn stopped breathing. Her hands gripped the fabric of her cheap dress so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The judges unanimously awarded this submission a perfect score of 100 points, Charles announced, his voice ringing out like a thunderclap. A feat that has not been accomplished at this invitational in over a decade. Ladies and gentlemen, the winner of the Best in Show. Charles looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd. Goes to entry number 412. A late harvest Pinot Gris, titled Briarwood Crown. Submitted by Evelyn Hayes of Briarwood Estate. Complete stunned silence blanketed the ballroom. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. The name Briarwood Estate meant nothing to the Seattle elite, but to the Willamette Valley contingent scattered throughout the room, it was a massive, seismic shock. Wyatt Preston's wine glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. He stared at the stage, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of absolute, uncomprehending horror. He whipped his head around to stare at Evelyn, his face draining of all color. Evelyn didn't look at him, she couldn't. Her legs were trembling so violently she thought she might collapse. She pushed herself off the wall, stepping out from the shadows. "I am Evelyn Hayes," she called out, her voice cracking initially, before she cleared her throat, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am here." As she walked down the center aisle toward the stage, the shock finally broke. A slow clap started from the judges' table, led by Charles Harrington himself. It rippled through the crowd, growing louder and more frantic, until the entire ballroom erupted into a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. Evelyn walked past the shattered glass at Wyatt Preston's feet, her head held high, stepping into the brilliant, blinding light of the main stage. The alchemist had spun gold from rot, and the world was finally paying attention. The grand ballroom of the Seattle Hotel descended into absolute, unprecedented chaos as Evelyn Hayes stood on the stage, the heavy, gold-plated Best in Show trophy clutched tightly against her chest. A literal stampede of the culinary world's most powerful figures rushed the stage. The polite, restrained decorum of the Pacific Northwest Vintners Invitational instantly evaporated. Distributors in custom-tailored suits shoved past renowned wine critics, desperate to get within speaking distance of the woman they had completely ignored just an hour earlier. Charles Harrington, the legendary master sommelier, had to physically position himself in front of Evelyn to shield her from the onslaught. He raised his hands, demanding order, but the crowd was operating on pure, unadulterated capitalist instinct. They all knew the reality of the wine market. A perfect 100-point score from Harrington was not just a rating, it was a license to print money. "Miss Hayes!" shouted a breathless man with a silk pocket square, elbowing his way to the front of the mob. "Jonathan Montgomery, representing the Continental Dining Group. We want exclusive distribution rights. Name your price, right now." Before Evelyn could even process the words, a tall, imposing woman in a sharp white blazer cut him off. "Isabella Rossi, Global Imports. We will double whatever Continental is offering and provide a $2 million advance on your next 3 vintages. Just sign a letter of intent tonight." Evelyn stared down at the frantic sea of faces, her mind spinning. 12 hours ago, she had $14 in her bank account and was facing eviction. Now, millionaires were practically screaming at each other, trying to throw fortunes at her feet. She looked across the room and saw Wyatt Preston standing near the exit, his face a sickly, pallid shade of gray. His entourage had completely abandoned him, flocking toward the stage to get a glimpse of the new queen of the valley. For the first time in his arrogant, privileged life, Wyatt looked utterly, hopelessly defeated. Evelyn leaned into the microphone, her voice carrying a calm, unyielding authority that she had inherited directly from her late father. "Thank you all for your generous offers," Evelyn said, the massive room instantly hushing to catch her every word. "But Briarwood Crown is not a mass-produced commodity. We yielded a remarkably small, highly concentrated batch. I have exactly 1,200 bottles in existence, and they will not be sold to the highest bidder in a chaotic free-for-all." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Scarcity was the only thing wealthier buyers loved, more than quality. By announcing the incredibly limited supply, Evelyn had just thrown gasoline onto a raging fire. William Thatcher, a notoriously ruthless restaurant magnate from New York who owned a syndicate of Michelin-starred establishments, stepped forward. He was a man who rarely spoke loudly because his money did the shouting for him. He looked up at Evelyn, his eyes calculating. 1,200 bottles, William repeated, his voice smooth and deadly serious. I will purchase the entire inventory, every single bottle, $1,500 per unit. That is $1.8 million. I will wire the funds to your account the moment the banks open on Monday morning. The ballroom gasped. $1,500 for a half bottle of unproven first-year dessert wine was astronomical. It was a price tag usually reserved for century-old European vintages. Evelyn didn't flinch. She looked William Thatcher dead in the eye. $1.8 million, and you cover the cost of secure, climate-controlled armored transport from my cellar to your facilities. I will not risk the integrity of the wine in standard freight. William smiled, a genuine expression of respect. Agreed, Miss Hayes. It is a pleasure doing business with you. The deal was struck right there on the stage, witnessed by the entire industry. Evelyn had done it. She had saved Briarwood. When Evelyn drove back into Oak Haven on Monday morning, the small town felt entirely different. The news of the Seattle triumph had already hit the agricultural wire services, and the local newspaper had splashed her name across the front page. The farmers who had laughed at her in the diner now watched her truck roll down Main Street with wide, astonished eyes. She parked her battered pickup directly in front of First National Bank. She didn't bother changing out of her travel-wrinkled clothes. She walked through the heavy glass doors, the gold trophy tucked casually under her arm like a bag of groceries, and marched straight toward Mitchell Reed's cubicle. Mitchell looked up from his computer, his eyes bulging as he saw her approaching. He had clearly read the morning news. He stood up so fast, his rolling chair slammed into the filing cabinet behind him. Evelyn, Mitchell stammered, sweat visibly beading on his forehead. We saw the news. The whole board is just... We are absolutely thrilled for you. It's a remarkable achievement for Oak Haven. Evelyn didn't say a word. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out a certified cashier's check for $650,000, the entirety of her father's mortgage plus the punitive late fees Mitchell had gleefully tacked on, and slammed it down onto his desk. The debt is cleared, Mitchell, Evelyn said, her voice dripping with ice. Process the payoff immediately, and let the board know that I will be moving all of Briarwood's operational accounts to the regional credit union by the end of the week. I don't do business with institutions that try to bury my family. Mitchell opened his mouth to apologize, to grovel, but Evelyn simply turned on her heel and walked out of the bank. The heavy burden that had crushed her chest for 6 months vanished in an instant. She stepped out into the crisp spring air, taking a deep, triumphant breath. She was going home. But out on the edge of town, sitting in the cab of his midnight black truck, Wyatt Preston watched her leave the bank. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles cracked. He had been humiliated. His investors were already calling, demanding to know why Preston Farms had been publicly upstaged by a bankrupt girl fermenting rotten fruit. Wyatt was a man who built his empire on dominance, and Evelyn Hayes had just publicly slit his throat. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "Yeah, it's me," Wyatt snarled into the receiver. "Thatcher's transport trucks don't arrive until Wednesday. That means the entire inventory is still sitting in that dilapidated, unsecured barn. I want it gone. All of it. Smash every single bottle into dust. If she has no product, she breaches the Thatcher contract, and she loses the millions. Make it happen tonight." The moon was completely obscured by thick, rolling clouds, casting Briarwood Estate into pitch-black darkness. Evelyn was fast asleep in the main farmhouse, her body finally surrendering to the profound exhaustion that had accumulated over the past agonizing year. For the first time since her father's funeral, she was dreaming peacefully, down by the aging wooden barn that housed the cellar. The silence of the night was broken by the soft, crunching sound of heavy boots on gravel. 2 men, dressed head to toe in dark clothing, slipped through the tree line bordering the Preston property. They carried heavy steel crowbars and thick canvas bags. Wyatt had hired outside muscle from the city, men who didn't care about wine, farming, or local politics. They were being paid $50,000 to turn $1.8 million worth of liquid gold into sticky glass shrapnel on the cellar floor. They approached the heavy oak doors of the barn. The lock was an ancient, rusted padlock that offered practically no resistance. One of the men jammed his crowbar into the hasp, snapping it with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed into the night. They pulled the doors open and slipped inside, flicking on small, heavily taped flashlights that emitted only narrow slits of light. They crept down the stone steps into the subterranean cellar. There, stacked in perfect, beautiful rows, were the 1,200 slender bottles of Briarwood Crown, their wax seals glowing faintly in the dim light. "Jackpot," the larger man whispered, raising his crowbar. "Start swinging, don't leave a single one intact." He brought the heavy steel bar back, preparing to smash it through the center of the first stack. Suddenly, a blinding 1,000-lumen halogen work light flared to life, illuminating the entire cellar with the intensity of a stadium. The intruders froze, throwing their hands up to shield their eyes. Sitting in a folding chair at the far end of the cellar, a double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun resting comfortably across his lap, was Samuel Brooks. The grizzled farmhand hadn't slept. He hadn't even taken his boots off. He knew exactly how men like Wyatt Preston operated. A wounded animal was always the most dangerous, and Samuel had spent his entire life protecting the Hayes family from predators. "You boys are a long way from the city," Samuel said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded absolute terror. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The menacing click of the shotgun's dual hammers being cocked backward echoed off the stone walls like a thunderclap. The men dropped their crowbars instantly. The heavy steel clattered loudly against the floor. They were thugs, but they weren't stupid. They were staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon held by a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. "Don't shoot, old man," the larger intruder stammered, raising his hands high into the air. "We were just hired. We don't have a problem with you." "You have a problem now," Samuel replied, standing up slowly, the shotgun never wavering from the center of the man's chest. "Kick the bars into the corner. Then get on your knees and lace your fingers behind your heads." 10 minutes later, Evelyn burst into the cellar, wearing a heavy robe over her pajamas, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the two men kneeling on the floor, and then looked at Samuel, who was leaning casually against a wine barrel, keeping the men covered. "Samuel? What is this?" Evelyn gasped. "Pest control, Miss Evelyn," Samuel said calmly. "Caught these two rats trying to smash the inventory. Care to guess who sent them?" Evelyn felt a surge of adrenaline so potent it made her dizzy. The initial shock rapidly morphed into a white-hot, blinding fury. Wyatt Preston hadn't just tried to outmaneuver her in the boardroom. He had actively attempted to destroy her livelihood like a petty, vicious criminal. She walked over to the kneeling men. She didn't look scared. She looked dangerous. "Wyatt Preston hired you," Evelyn stated. It wasn't a question. The larger man hesitated, looking at the shotgun, then back at Evelyn. "He paid us cash, said the barn was empty, said it was an insurance job. We didn't know anyone was guarding it." Evelyn pulled her cell phone from her robe pocket. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She dialed Wyatt Preston's personal cell phone number. It rang 4 times before the arrogant patriarch answered. "Who is this?" Wyatt barked, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "It's Evelyn Hayes, Wyatt," she said, her voice echoing coldly off the stone walls of the cellar. "I'm standing in my cellar right now. Your boys are on their knees in front of me, and Samuel is currently deciding whether or not to use them for target practice." Silence fell over the line, a heavy, suffocating silence. "I don't know what you're talking about," Wyatt finally stammered, his voice losing every ounce of its usual bravado. "You're crazy, Evelyn. They have the cash you paid them in their pockets, Wyatt." They have text messages on their burners. Evelyn lied flawlessly, though she knew criminals of this caliber always left a paper trail. I am going to call Sheriff Miller in exactly 5 minutes. I am going to hand these men over. I'm going to press federal destruction of property charges, corporate espionage charges, and trespassing. You won't just lose your farm, Wyatt. You will go to federal prison. Wait, Wyatt yelled into the phone, genuine panic finally breaking through. Wait, Evelyn, please. Don't call the sheriff. We can handle this. Whatever you want. Name your price. Evelyn smiled, a hard, merciless expression. She had the king in checkmate. You own the water rights to the Lower Valley Reservoir, Evelyn said, her voice like cracking ice. The rights you used to choke out my father's irrigation lines during the drought. I want them. All of them. Transferred to Briarwood Estate. And I want a public, irrevocable declaration that Preston Farms is dissolving its monopoly on the regional glass and distribution supply chains. That's millions of dollars in infrastructure, Wyatt screamed. You're trying to gut me. I am gutting you, Evelyn corrected him coldly. Because if I call the sheriff, you lose the infrastructure anyway when your company goes bankrupt from the legal fees and the scandal. You have 60 seconds to decide, Wyatt. Water rights or handcuffs? The silence stretched on, thick and agonizing. Evelyn could hear Wyatt's ragged breathing over the phone. He was trapped, cornered by the very woman he had relentlessly mocked and tormented. He had tried to break her, but the pressure had only forged her into steel. Fine, Wyatt whispered, the words sounding like a death rattle. You'll have the contracts by dawn. Evelyn hung up the phone. She looked at the two thugs. Get out of my cellar. If I ever see your faces in this valley again, Samuel won't bother asking you to kneel. The men scrambled to their feet and fled up the stairs, vanishing into the night. Evelyn stood in the quiet cellar, surrounded by the beautiful, amber-filled bottles. The crisis was over. The farm was safe. The valley's water supply would be liberated, protecting all the smaller farmers from Wyatt's tyranny. Samuel lowered the shotgun, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his weathered eyes. Your daddy would be incredibly proud of you, Miss Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the old farmhand, tears of relief finally spilling down her cheeks. We did it, Samuel. We really did it. The sun breached the horizon, painting the Willamette Valley in brilliant shades of tangerine and violet. Evelyn Hayes stood on the wraparound porch of the farmhouse, a steaming mug of black coffee warming her calloused hands. She had not slept a single wink since the terrifying confrontation in the cellar, yet she felt an electrifying surge of boundless energy coursing through her veins. Down the gravel driveway, exactly at 6 a.m, a sleek silver sedan crunched to a halt. Out stepped an incredibly nervous man wearing a sharp suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase toward her home. It was Maxwell Reed, a senior partner at the most ruthless corporate law firm in Portland, and Wyatt Preston's personal attorney. Maxwell wiped heavy perspiration from his brow, completely ignoring the brisk morning chill. He climbed the wooden porch stairs, deliberately avoiding eye contact with Samuel Brooks, who was leaning against the railing while carving a piece of cedar with a hunting knife. Maxwell unlatched his expensive briefcase with trembling fingers and presented a thick stack of densely typed legal documents. Evelyn set her coffee down and reviewed the important papers with absolute, cold, clinical precision. It was all perfectly detailed. The absolute transfer of the Lower Valley Reservoir water rights to Briarwood Estate in perpetuity, and the officially signed dissolution of the Preston Farms distribution monopoly. Wyatt had surrendered completely, utterly broken by the terrifying threat of federal imprisonment. Evelyn signed the required documents, her bold signature unwavering, effectively dismantling a tyrannical agricultural empire before breakfast. Maxwell quickly packed the signed copies back into his briefcase. He muttered a pathetic apology on behalf of his client. Evelyn let out a short, hollow laugh that held absolutely no genuine amusement for the corporate lawyer. Tell Wyatt that if he ever steps foot on my side of the property line again, or if he ever tries to sabotage another independent farmer in this beautiful valley, I will absolutely ruin him permanently. Now get off my private land, immediately." Maxwell scrambled down the wooden stairs, throwing his body into the silver sedan and violently speeding away, leaving a massive plume of white dust trailing in his panicked wake. Evelyn looked at her loyal friend Samuel, who simply nodded his head approvingly. The corrupt king was dead, and a glorious new era for Oakhaven had begun. By Wednesday afternoon, the quiet, rustic tranquility of Briarwood Estate was completely shattered by the sudden arrival of 3 heavily armored transport trucks. Flanked by intense private security contractors wearing thick tactical vests, the massive convoy looked more suited for safely transporting solid gold bullion than agricultural liquid products. William Thatcher, the notoriously ruthless New York restaurant magnate, had spared absolutely no expense to carefully protect his massive investment. William himself had specially flown in on a luxurious private jet, arriving at the rustic estate in a chauffeured black town car to personally oversee the entire, incredibly delicate extraction. William walked deeply into the cool, damp stone cellar, pausing to deeply inhale the lingering, wonderfully intoxicating scent of the noble rot that had forever changed the financial destiny of the Hayes family. "It is a truly breathtaking operation you have successfully running here, Miss Hayes," William remarked sincerely, watching his armed security team carefully load the beautiful wax-sealed bottles into custom-built, highly shock-absorbent wooden crates. "I have purchased massive vineyards in beautiful Tuscany and huge estates in gorgeous Napa Valley. Oh, but I have absolutely never witnessed a stunning masterclass in pure human resilience quite like this incredible feat." Evelyn watched the final heavy crate leave the dark cellar, feeling a profoundly deep sense of bittersweet accomplishment warming her chest. The miraculous wine was physically gone, but her family farm was completely saved from absolute ruin. "It was absolutely not a solo effort, Mr. Thatcher. The living land actively dictates the necessary rules. We simply listened to what it truly needed to do." William smiled warmly, reaching directly into his beautifully tailored suit jacket to formally produce a crisp, perfectly embossed white envelope. "Your massive payment in full, safely wired directly to your local regional credit union banking accounts." But I definitely did not excitedly fly across the entire massive country merely to politely act as a highly overpaid delivery boy. William confidently handed her the thick white envelope and took a deliberate step closer, his facial expression instantly shifting from a simple corporate wine buyer to a deeply serious, aggressive financial investor. "I want to massively finance the immediate incredible expansion of Briarwood Estate. I am formally offering you exactly $5 million in rapid capital to beautifully upgrade your farming facilities, completely replant the tragically lost vines, and build a truly state-of-the-art public luxury wine tasting room. C'est parfois. In direct exchange, my massive restaurant syndicate simply receives the exclusive, guaranteed first right of absolute refusal on all your future miraculous dessert vintages. You legally maintain 100% total ownership of the agricultural land and the brand. I merely want to completely ensure that my dining establishments are always the premier destination for the magnificent Briarwood crown." But Evelyn stared deeply at the powerful, wealthy man, feeling completely stunned by his words. $5 million. It was vastly more liquid money than her late father could have ever comprehensively imagined in a long lifetime of brutally toiling physically outside. 1 year later, the Willamette Valley looked fundamentally different. The oppressive, dark shadow of Preston Farms had completely receded, beautifully replaced by a flourishing community of happy, independent growers who now had uninhibited access to the vital reservoir water. Wyatt Preston, plagued by severe financial hemorrhaging and multiple angry investor lawsuits following the disastrous loss of his monopoly, had been quietly forced out of his own company by his furious board of directors. He had sold his massive mansion and quickly relocated to a small condo in sunny Florida, effectively exiled permanently from the agricultural world he once ruthlessly ruled. Meanwhile, Briarwood Estate had completely transformed into the absolute, shining crown jewel of the beautiful Pacific Northwest wine country. With William Thatcher's massive capital investment, Evelyn had completely revitalized the historic property. The old, incredibly dilapidated tractor shed had been brilliantly redesigned into a gorgeous, exceptionally modern tasting room, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, perfectly overlooking the endless rolling vineyards. The rustic charm of the original farmhouse remained meticulously preserved, but the operational facilities were now fully equipped with the finest, incredibly cutting-edge viticulture technology available globally. Samuel Brooks had been officially promoted to head of total agricultural operations. The estate was wonderfully thriving, but the absolute true test of their continued success was rapidly approaching. It was crisp mid-October, and the incredibly stressful harvest season had finally returned. The entire global viticulture industry was intensely watching Briarwood with heavily bated breath, openly wondering if Evelyn could possibly replicate the miraculous success of the previous year. Jealous critics called the first vintage a bizarre, totally unrepeatable fluke. They arrogantly claimed the noble rot was merely a highly localized weather anomaly that would absolutely never strike the Sunny Valley again. Evelyn truly knew the complicated science, and she understood risks. She could not aggressively force Mother Nature to magically comply. As the final harvest weeks fast approached, the local weather remained stubbornly dry and perfectly, annoyingly clear. The sweet grapes on the lush vines were very healthy, incredibly plump, and thoroughly unremarkable. Evelyn stood quietly in the new tasting room, looking out over the beautiful fields alongside Samuel. The bustling excitement of the massive estate felt slightly hollow without the creeping, terrifying thrill of the gray rot. "Looks like we are just making perfectly standard Pinot Gris this boring year, Samuel," Evelyn noted, a huge hint of genuine disappointment showing. Samuel gently adjusted his worn cap, his wise eyes scanning the distant horizon, where dark, incredibly heavy rain clouds were beginning to mysteriously gather over the huge western mountain ridge. "I would not be so incredibly sure about that, Miss Evelyn," Samuel rumbled softly, pointing a deeply calloused finger toward the darkening sky. "The valley has a wonderfully funny way of dramatically giving you exactly what you truly need, right when you completely stop desperately asking for it." That exact evening, a massive, shockingly unseasonable heavy storm front violently crashed directly into the peaceful turfs, bringing massive amounts of rain. Torrential, violently heavy downpours soaked the earth for 3 consecutive, incredibly dark days, completely halting all standard harvesting operations across the entire county. On the 4th morning, the heavy rain abruptly ceased, quickly replaced by a thick, suffocating blanket of heavy white fog that magically rolled off the recently acquired reservoir, tightly clinging to the delicate vines like deeply wet wool. By noon, the blazing autumn sun broke through the thick clouds, rapidly baking the heavy moisture into a dense, inescapable, sweltering humidity. Evelyn eagerly ran out into the wet fields, her heavy boots sinking deeply into the muddy soil. Her heart pounded a frantic, incredibly hopeful rhythm against her ribs. She rapidly approached the very first row of pristine vines, her hands shaking violently as she reached out to carefully inspect the heavy clusters. The beautiful, perfectly plump green skin was completely gone. In its wonderful place, the sweet grapes were puckered, violently shriveled, and thickly coated in a magnificent, glorious layer of powdery gray fuzz. The noble rot had miraculously returned, aggressively spreading its highly transformative, extremely lucrative decay across the entire 60-acre estate. Evelyn dropped to her muddy knees, throwing her head back and laughing incredibly loudly. The second magical harvest of Briarwood Crown successfully yielded exactly 3,000 beautiful bottles, all of which sold out in exactly 14 frantic minutes on the global luxury market. easily fetching an astonishing $2,000 per single unit. Evelyn Hayes had firmly cemented her agricultural legacy, beautifully proving to the entire world that true, unbelievable greatness is often successfully born from the dark ashes of absolute financial ruin. She happily poured a golden, beautifully syrupy measure of her incredible wine, silently toasting the wonderful, perfectly rotting gray fields that had magically made her a wildly successful, incredibly wealthy millionaire. What an absolutely incredible journey of sheer resilience and brilliant farming. Evelyn Hayes bravely transformed an utterly devastating agricultural disaster into a truly magnificent, massively lucrative wine empire, successfully defeating a totally ruthless corporate bully in the thrilling process. Her profoundly inspiring story beautifully proves that sometimes the darkest, most terrifying storms miraculously bring the absolute greatest, most profitable golden harvests imaginable. Did you completely love this truly dramatic, wonderfully inspiring tale of rural triumph? Please like this fantastic video, share it with your wonderful friends, and definitely subscribe to our awesome channel for vastly more amazing real-life stories.